The first light of January 8, 1815, struggled to break through a thick blanket of fog that covered the swamps and open fields just outside New Orleans. The damp Louisiana air hung heavy over the battlefield, muffling every sound except the distant splash of boots in the mud and the occasional command whispered through the ranks. Thousands of British soldiers stood ready, their bright red coats barely visible through the mist. These were not inexperienced recruits. Many were battle-hardened veterans who had fought against Napoleon across Europe and believed they were about to crush a much smaller American force. Confidence filled their camp. To them, capturing New Orleans seemed like the final step toward ending the War of 1812 with British dominance. However, General Andrew Jackson had prepared a defense unlike anything the British expected. Behind a long earthwork reinforced with mud, timber, and cotton bales, a remarkably diverse force waited in silence. American regulars stood shoulder to shoulder with Tennessee and Kentucky riflemen, Louisiana militia, free black soldiers, Choctaw warriors, and local volunteers. Though they came from different backgrounds, they shared a single purpose: to prevent the British Army from seizing the city and controlling the mouth of the Mississippi River. Neither army knew that thousands of miles away, diplomats had already signed the Treaty of Ghent on Christmas Eve, officially ending the war. The news, however, had not yet crossed the Atlantic Ocean. The men gathered on this cold morning believed they were about to fight a battle that could decide the future of North America. As the fog slowly began to lift, officers checked their watches, tightened sword belts, and rode along the lines giving final instructions. Drums echoed faintly through the mist, while artillery crews loaded heavy cannons with deadly precision. Every soldier understood that within minutes the silence would vanish. What awaited them was not a glorious parade into history, but one of the bloodiest and most devastating mornings either army would ever experience. As dawn grew brighter, the order to advance echoed through the British ranks. Drummers beat a steady rhythm, while officers raised their swords and urged their men forward with unwavering confidence. Long lines of red-coated infantry stepped into the open fields, expecting discipline and courage to overcome the American defenses. The plan seemed simple on paper. Specialized units carrying ladders and bundles of reeds, known as fascins, were supposed to cross the ditch in front of the American earthworks, allowing the main assault force to climb the defensive wall. But almost immediately, everything began to unravel. The thick morning fog and the confusion of the marshy terrain caused crucial delays. Some of the soldiers carrying the ladders lost their direction, while others became separated from the advancing columns. Without the equipment needed to cross the ditch, thousands of British infantrymen found themselves marching directly toward a fortified position with no practical way to breach it. Yet the advance continued. Officers, determined not to lose momentum, ordered their men forward. Despite the growing signs that the carefully prepared assault was falling apart, then the American line erupted. Massive cannons hidden behind the earthworks unleashed devastating volleys of grapeshot, turning the battlefield into a storm of iron. The tightly packed British formations, drilled to fight in orderly ranks, suddenly became perfect targets. Cannonballs tore through multiple soldiers at once, while clouds of musket smoke rolled over the defensive wall. Expert riflemen from Kentucky and Tennessee calmly picked off officers, sergeants, and flag bearers with deadly precision, disrupting command and spreading confusion throughout the advancing ranks. Still, many British soldiers refused to retreat. They pressed forward through mud slick with water and blood, stepping over fallen comrades while bullets snapped past their faces. The noise became almost unbearable, roaring artillery, crashing muskets, shouted commands, and the cries of the wounded blended into a single terrifying roar. What had begun as a confident advance was rapidly becoming a nightmare, as every yard gained came at an unimaginable human cost. Only minutes into the assault, the battlefield descended into complete chaos. The carefully timed British attack, which had relied on speed, coordination, and discipline, was collapsing under relentless American fire. Thick clouds of gunpowder smoke drifted across the field, making it nearly impossible for officers to see their own men. Orders were shouted, but disappeared beneath the thunder of artillery and the constant crack of muskets. Entire companies became separated, unsure whether to press forward or fall back. What had started as an organized military operation was quickly turning into a desperate struggle for survival. At the center of the disaster was the British commander, Sir Edward Pakenham. Determined to inspire his troops, he rode close to the front lines despite the deadly barrage. It was a decision that proved fatal. An American cannon blast struck nearby, sending fragments flying through the air. Moments later, musket fire hit him again. Gravely wounded, Pakenham fell from his horse as aides rushed to his side. His injuries were catastrophic, and he would soon die from them. The loss of the commanding general sent shockwaves through the army. Before the troops could recover, Major General Samuel Gibbs was also struck by devastating gunfire and mortally wounded while leading another assault. Lieutenant General John Keane suffered serious wounds as well, leaving the British High Command in disarray. Without clear leadership, confusion spread rapidly through the advancing ranks. Some officers attempted to rally their men, while others ordered withdrawals that neighboring units never heard. Soldiers found themselves trapped in open ground, exposed to relentless cannon fire and accurate rifle shots from behind Jackson's earthworks. Horses, panicked by the explosions, galloped wildly across the battlefield without riders. Adding to the confusion, every passing minute increased the horror. Fallen soldiers covered the muddy field, making it difficult for those still advancing to maintain formation. Wounded men cried out for help, while others continued fighting beside them. The British assault had effectively shattered. In less than half an hour, one of the finest armies in the world had been transformed into a broken force, struggling simply to escape the deadly field before them. The retreat quickly became a desperate race for survival. Confused bugle calls and shouted commands struggled to cut through the thunder of cannon fire, leaving many British soldiers uncertain whether they had been ordered to withdraw or continue the assault. Some units turned back immediately, while others remained trapped in the open, still attempting to advance toward the American earthworks. The lack of communication only added to the disaster. Men who had survived the deadly advance now found themselves exposed once again, forced to cross the same open field under relentless enemy fire. General Andrew Jackson's defenders maintained their discipline. Artillery crews reloaded with remarkable speed, sending fresh rounds of grapeshot crashing into the retreating formations. The booming cannons echoed across the marshes as riflemen carefully selected targets, aiming at officers trying to reorganize their broken regiments. Every explosion scattered more soldiers, and every volley left new casualties lying in the mud. The once proud British assault had dissolved into scattered groups of exhausted men struggling to escape the killing zone. The battlefield itself became a haunting scene of devastation. Broken muskets, torn flags, shattered ladders, and abandoned equipment lay scattered among hundreds of fallen soldiers. Many of the wounded reached out to passing comrades, pleading for help, but few could stop. Those who paused risked becoming casualties themselves. Army surgeons waited behind the lines with limited supplies, preparing for an endless stream of injured men. The cries of pain mixed with the groans of wounded horses and the distant rumble of artillery, creating a grim soundtrack that survivors would remember for the rest of their lives. As the smoke gradually lifted, the full scale of the defeat became impossible to ignore. Entire British companies had been virtually destroyed, and some regiments had lost a large portion of their officers. In striking contrast, the American defenders suffered only a fraction of those losses. What had been expected to be a swift and decisive British victory instead became one of the most lopsided defeats in British military history. By the end of the morning, the muddy fields outside New Orleans stood as silent testimony to the terrible cost of a battle that had lasted only a short time but left scars that would endure for generations. As the guns finally fell silent, an eerie stillness settled over the battlefield. The smoke that had hidden the fighting slowly drifted away, revealing the staggering cost of the morning's battle. American soldiers cautiously climbed over the earthworks, many unable to believe what they were seeing. The fields before them were covered with abandoned weapons, broken equipment. Only a few hours earlier, one of the most experienced armies in the world had marched confidently toward New Orleans. Now, it had suffered one of the most crushing defeats in its history. General Andrew Jackson rode along the American lines, receiving cheers from exhausted soldiers who realized they had achieved something extraordinary. His carefully prepared defenses, combined with the determination of his diverse force, had stopped a powerful invasion. Volunteers from Tennessee and Kentucky stood beside regular U.S. Army troops, Louisiana militia, free black soldiers, Choctaw warriors, and local citizens who had fought together despite their different backgrounds. Their victory became an enduring symbol of unity and determination in the face of overwhelming odds. News of the battle spread across the United States with astonishing speed. Newspapers celebrated Jackson as the hero who had saved New Orleans and defended the nation's honor. Public celebrations erupted in cities and towns, with church bells ringing and crowds praising the remarkable triumph. Although few Americans knew it at the time, the Treaty of Ghent had already been signed weeks before the battle, officially ending the War of 1812. Because communication across the Atlantic took weeks, neither army had known that peace had already been agreed upon before the fighting began, even though the battle did not change the terms of the treaty. Its impact on American history was enormous. The stunning victory restored national confidence after years of difficult fighting and transformed Andrew Jackson into one of the country's most celebrated military leaders. The reputation he earned at New Orleans eventually helped propel him to the presidency. More importantly, the battle became a defining chapter in America's national story, remembered not only for its strategic success but also for the extraordinary courage displayed by ordinary men facing overwhelming danger. Long after the smoke cleared from the fields outside New Orleans, the memory of the battle continued to haunt those who had survived it. Official reports focused on casualty numbers, military strategy, and the remarkable American victory, but they could never fully capture the human suffering experienced during those final, brutal minutes. Soldiers who returned home carried physical wounds, while many others lived with memories they could never erase. The cries of wounded comrades, the deafening roar of cannon fire, and the sight of the battlefield covered with fallen men remained with them for the rest of their lives. Historians often remember the Battle of New Orleans as Andrew Jackson's greatest military triumph. Yet the terrible reality faced by ordinary soldiers is sometimes overshadowed by stories of victory and national pride. Contemporary letters and eyewitness accounts describe scenes of exhaustion, fear, and unimaginable destruction. Medical care in 1815 was extremely limited, and many wounded soldiers died hours or even days after the fighting had ended. Surgeons worked without modern anesthesia or antibiotics, doing everything they could with the tools available, while countless families waited for news that would never bring their loved ones home. The battle also serves as a reminder of the tragic irony of war. Unknown to the men fighting that cold January morning, peace had already been agreed upon in Europe through the Treaty of Ghent. Weeks of slow communication across the Atlantic meant that thousands of soldiers marched into battle without realizing the war had officially ended. Lives were lost not because peace was impossible, but because the news simply had not arrived in time. More than 2 centuries later, the Battle of New Orleans remains one of the most decisive victories in American military history. Yet beyond the celebrations and heroic legends lies a sobering truth. Every battlefield is filled with individual stories of courage, sacrifice, fear, and loss. The final minutes at New Orleans were not simply a dramatic ending to the War of 1812. They were a stark reminder of war's devastating human cost. Behind every famous victory are countless untold stories, making this battle as heartbreaking as it was historic.